thanks for coming out, guys. Hopefully we'll teach some new things, new tricks. Raise the hands. Who's done some euro nymphing before? Got a couple. All right, cool. For the rest of you, we'll go over some basics, go into some tips and tricks, general equipment, that kind of stuff. So these are all fish on the screen from this year. I do a lot of euro nymphing with my kids, my wife. They've all picked it up. All three of my boys probably catch more fish than most adults. I think if we tallied it up, they're probably in the hundreds from last year each. We do quite a bit of fishing. We go out. My wife a lot of times works Friday, Saturday, so I duck out Friday and Saturday and we go fishing. So, all right, let's jump into this. So we're gonna talk a little bit about, I guess, what is euro nymphing to start, and then why you should care about it. We'll talk a little bit about gear, a little bit about casting techniques, a little bit about leader lengths, and then we'll talk where to do it, how to identify sections of the river, things like that. So, okay. So what is euro nymphing? So European style nymphing, some people call it contact nymphing, tight line nymphing, but a lot of us just refer to it as euro nymphing. So originated in Europe, that's why it's called euro nymphing. So it's really common across the Atlantic. Fairly recent introduction to fly fishing over here, really started gaining popularity within the last 10 years or so. And euro nymphing is a great way to detect bites that you wouldn't normally detect. So you're maintaining constant contact with your nymphs, and what that does is it allows you to watch your line and watch for very subtle pauses, very subtle takes, dips in the line that using a typical indicator rig, a lot of times some of those subtle takes, they won't even take your indicator under the water. But using a euro nymphing style, you can watch for some of those pauses and catch a lot more fish. So I probably do euro nymphing 50 to 60% of the time. I'll start off with doing some searching tactics with an indicator, find kind of where fish are holding, and then I'll go back and I'll work a section in more depth with my euro line. So that way I can kind of customize depth, get to where the fish are feeding at. All right, let's go a little bit about equipment. So we've got, of course, rod and reel. That's pretty obvious. For euro rods, I'll cover a little bit more on that here on the next slide as far as what to look out for. But honestly, just any fly rod and reel you can euro nymph with. There's some advantages to using a dedicated euro rod. You're going to want depending on your preference, a euro line or a floating line works okay as well. If that's what you've got, fish it. And then getting down to more of the specifics for euro fishing, having either a pre-built euro leader or one that you've kind of built yourself, which is what I've got on my rod. Having I typically build mine with mono, starting off with some Maxima Ultra Green 20-pound, 12-pound, some cider material, and then tippet rings are optional. I like them. It keeps me from doing knots over and over. And then, of course, the basics that you would use for any other style of fishing. So your tippet, your flies, split shot to help get you down deeper, those kind of things. So we'll talk a little bit about rod and reel. You guys probably noticed first thing here is this rod's kind of long. This is an 11 footer. Actually, I think it's 10, 10. Typical fly rods are 9 foot is pretty standard, or shorter if you're on smaller creeks. But having a longer rod does help with getting a little bit more reach. A lot of your Euro nymphing, you're fishing within 10 to 20 feet. It's very, very close quarters fishing. You're right there where the fish are at. Trying to be very stealthy and stocky on them. But that longer reach on the rod does help you to get a little bit more distance. Helps you. There's not a whole lot of mending and doing all of that kind of stuff with Euro nymphing because you're tight to the line. You're high sticking, so it's not as necessary to have the length for mending, but it's great for getting a little distance. And then typically 2 to 4 weight. So this is a 3 weight. This is my kind of go-to setup for fishing most of the water around here. I'm using a 3 weight. And on this rod, you can actually see I've got a floating line on this. I'll talk about some of the benefits of using either a floating line or a dedicated. This is actually a Euro line here. It's got a little bit thinner diameter on it than what a floating line does. There's some benefits to both. And we'll go to that point. So, all right, so lines. When you're Euro nymphing, a lot of times you've only got 10 to 20 feet of line out. You're not using a ton of line. So does it really matter to have a specific dedicated Euro line? Yes and no. At most, I might have 10 or 15 feet of that out of my rod at any given point. It does cut through the wind a little bit better. It is also has a solid core, so there's a little bit more sensitivity. It's not going to stretch like some fly lines would. So you do have a little bit more advantage in that sense. As far as a floating line, why would you use a floating line? I will take an indicator with me, and within a few seconds, I now have an indicator nymphing rod or a Euro nymphing rod. So I like the floating line in the sense that if I need to get a little more distance, I'll use that floating line to get me out 20, 30, 40 feet and have an indicator on so that I can cover some water that with Euro nymphing you might not be able to reach. And there's also another rig called a mono rig, which you would build a longer leader out of your monofilament line and then go to the Euro leader after that. So talk a little bit about tippet and fly selection. So tippet size, I'm typically in the waters around here fishing 4X to 5X. Occasionally I'll downsize to 6 or 7X if it's really clear water, spooky fish, fishing Henry's Fork, for example. A lot of time I'm downsizing my line. South Fork I might upsize, or Madison I might upsize to 3X and 4X on it. Just depends on water clarity, the spookiness of the fish, time of the season, and the size of flies that I'm fishing. If I'm gonna fish a heavier, bigger fly, I'm gonna upsize my tippet 1 or 2 sizes. So if I'm fishing, for example, a big stone fly like this with a heavy bead, big hook, I'm probably gonna up to like 3X. And then on some of my smaller like Betas and smaller Perdigons, midges, I'll size down to like a 5 or a 6X.
And that's where your tippet ring becomes useful as you change the tippet size.
Yeah, so for mine, you can see where my tippet ring is here. So instead of having to retie every time to the cider material, I can just tie to the tippet ring. I believe I only switched this cider material twice last last season, and that's because of using the tippet rings. So you do save on some on your cider material, and then I'll just retie with. So right now I think I've got 5x here, and then, 4x here and 5x to my point fly. I do like to size down to my point fly, just in case you hit a snag, because a lot of time you're nymphing, you're right on the bottom. If you snag, hopefully you're only breaking off one fly instead of both. As far as flies go, they are usually very similar to the flies that you would use for regular indicator nymphing. The only difference is a lot of them are kind of slimmed down and heavier. So you're using heavier materials and less materials at the same time. So typically, and you can see a lot of these Paragons, there's not much to these flies. They're very, very basic. They're usually flashy, colorful. You guys can all come up afterwards and kind of take a look. This is about 50 of my favorite flies for around here. I pulled these out of my various boxes and kind of put them in here for this this demo. But I will use streamers during nymphing. I'll use some bigger bugs, but you'll notice that they're very heavy. A lot of times I've got a tungsten bead, or I've got lead wire wrapped, and then I'm going to a pretty thin style streamer. And a lot of times I like jig hooks too, because jig hooks, when they're going down the stream, the hook is up, so you're not catching in the rocks and snags. A regular hook, so this is a jig hook, it's going to float down the stream like that, hook up. And then whereas a typical fly, a lot of times it's going to go hook down. So right, any questions up to this point as far as rods, lines, tippet, flies? All right, cool, keep going. So this is my basic leader setup. I've got some of my additional tips that I've got in blue, and if anybody's interested, we can probably send out an email list if you want a copy of this presentation for after. But this is a pretty standard setup. So you've got your fly line down to about 5, roughly. Well, I'll change this up a little bit. You'll see on mine I've only got about 1.5 feet of 20 pound down to about 3 feet of 12 pound. Just depends on how far out you're trying to get your line. If you're fishing pretty close quarters, you can shorten that down just a little bit. But that's kind of my minimum, is about 18 inches and then 3 feet, and then up to about 5 feet and 5 feet of each for the top end of your rig. And then that's going to go down into your cider material, attaching those with your favorite line-to-line knot. Blood knot works well. Uni to uni works well. Blood knot's a little bit thinner in diameter, so it helps clear the guides a little bit easier. I'm going to do that down to a tippet ring. And then same as pretty much every other nymphing rig after that. So you've got your tippet down to your flies. Typically I'll do for Euro nymphing, I like to have my heavier fly down lower. I will change that up depending on how I'm feeling that day. There's some pros and cons to both. With a heavy fly down on point, you're going to get your flies down faster. And then with your lighter fly on point, it can have a little bit more of a natural presentation as it's kind of free flowing in the stream behind your heavier fly. There's also you can also do a tag end to your lighter fly. That's pretty common as well to see. I've just direct tied these. I don't have a tag end here, but that's another good way to have just improve your presentation a little bit on the fly, is to have your top fly be on a separate tag end.
So when you tie it straight in, like you say you could tie it straight in as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how I've got mine.
Yeah. And you then tie the bottom to the shank of the hook or down at the eye again?
Depends. So if a lot of times I'm fishing barbless, I don't want that to the shank, I want that to the eye. Or on these really, really tiny flies where there's not much of a barb, I will tie eye to eye. In fact, you can see on this one, I'm eye to eye on this one.
Okay.
If I've got a little bit bigger fly up top, then I will do from the hook shank. Any other questions on leader setup? Okay, let's talk a little bit about casting. The cool thing about Euro nymphing, it's probably the easiest cast in fly fishing. It's a water load cast. So what that means is when I'm at the end of my drift, flies are downstream from me, I'm going to allow the weight of the flies to load my rod, and then I'm going to just cast back upstream. It's almost more of a lob than a cast for Euro nymphing. So that is really the basics of it. I'll go over the tuck cast here in just a minute. That does help get your flies to hit the water first, get them down deeper a little bit quicker. For casting with, or for while you're in your drift for Euro nymphing, typically your high stick. So I've usually got my rod up high, not so high that I don't have enough room to set the hook, but I'm maintaining contact with my nymph and I'm maintaining depth. That's what this cider material comes in handy for. You can watch right where your cider's at in the stream, and you can adjust your depth. So as you're going through a hole, let's say the hole at the top is 18 inches, in the middle it's 3 feet, and at the tail end of it, it's 2 feet. With a regular indicator rig, your nymphs are at the same depth the whole time. But once you're going through a deep hole, a lot of times you've got fish sitting at the bottom of that hole. So with the Euro rig, it's really easy to drop your rod tip as you're going through, change your depth as you're going through the hole, and then raise your depth at the back end of the hole. It allows you to work a section of river much more efficiently and effectively than a typical indicator rig would. All right. Any questions on casting or drifts so far? All right. So this is a guy that I like to follow. There's actually 2 guys, Trout Bitten, and then now I'm forgetting the name of his YouTube channel. I'll remember it by the end. But there are a few guys that are pretty good on YouTube about how to Euro nymph, going into more kind of how to master the Euro nymphing. But with a tuck cast, essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to get your flies, and at the very end of your cast, you're just gonna pop your rod tip just a little bit so that your flies roll out and are hitting the water first. It takes just a little bit of practice, but I will send this out, and I've got a link to a video on how to do a tuck cast. For today, I think we'll skip this portion of it, and then if you're interested in learning more about the tuck cast, you've got a link to it. All right, let's see. Let's talk about where to fish. You can Euro nymph effectively just about anywhere that you can fish any other style of fishing. What I'm going to change with my Euro nymph setup is I'm going to change how close together I've got my flies. This is kind of my standard setup, about 18 inches apart. But if I'm fishing a shallow riffle, then I might have these 8 to 12 inches apart so that I can still have both flies work in that section of water. But current seams are a great place to fish. Deeper pools and structure. Really, Euro nymphing is really effective when you're in around a lot of the same areas that you would typically fish. What I like to say is take a cast, take a step. So as you're working a run or a deeper hole, you can cast in tight, stay further out than where you think the fish might be. Start close in, and then slowly work your way out. So I'll take a cast, take a step out, take a cast, take a step out, and I'll work my way deeper and deeper and deeper. All right. Got a couple of pictures of, so this is a good example of where you've got some structure, you've got a big rock, you've got a hole, you've got a couple of seams, and you've got some feeding channels. So if I was Euro nymphing, I would probably start right back here. I'd probably work on the back side of this hole right here. Start on the back side, I'd work these current seams here and then in, and then I'd come back out, I'd come up to the next spot, I'd work my way out to the edge of the seam, and then I'd make sure I'd work these feeder channels coming in behind this rock. Tip about rocks: if a rock is above the water, not submerged, there's likely not a fish holding right behind it. Usually you've got a little bit of churning water right behind a rock that's not submerged. You can see the rock above the water. If a rock is below the surface of the water, you have water running through, and fish are going to hold tighter to that rock. So just with the way that water, forget what they call it, hydraulics, I guess, hydrodynamics, something like that. That sounds about right? Typically, that's where a couple of the areas that I like to try to Euro nymph. Here's another graphic just kind of showing kind of a deeper run. So you've got some current seams, and where you see the yellow fish, you've got current seams inside, then you've got current seams outside where you see these darker colored fish. And when a fish is actively feeding, they're likely going to come up a little bit shallower. So they might work out to where you see those darker brownish colored fish. And then if they're not actively feeding, they might go down into a little bit deeper water, holding water. But you can still fish them effectively. But this is why it's important to work your way from the inside of the run out. That way you're not stepping on fish on your way out. And that pretty much does it for the presentation today. We're gonna hop into the question section. What questions do you guys have?
I guess this kind of has to do with the casting, but the
Yeah.
idea is kind of to almost have, not quite tension, but almost have it so that it's not so much at a dead drift. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, you're trying to typically when I'm casting, I'm gonna cast up, get my flies down. I am gonna keep this line tight. I don't want any slack. So, because probably about half of the strikes on a good sensitive Euro rod, you can feel it taken. Because you're using materials that there's not a lot of play to it. We're typically using, I like to use fluoro tippet. It doesn't stretch like mono. Cider materials will stretch just a little bit. The mono will stretch just a little bit, but then a lot of times you're using like a solid core fly line that's not going to stretch. You can kind of feel those takes. So you do want not necessarily to be lifting the flies up, but you want the line to be tight so that you can kind of feel what's going on. When you're right on the bottom, as you've done this for a while, you can start to feel the difference between little ticks of the rocks, where your flies are just kind of ticking on the rocks at the bottom, versus a subtle take. It'll feel just a little bit different. What I'm looking for is any hesitation at all to the fly line. A lot of times as you're watching this line, and I like to lead the line just a little bit, so I'm working my flies just right at or maybe slightly faster than the speed of the current. Helps me keep the line tight. as I'm leading the flies through, I'm looking for that line to just any movement whatsoever. It might go slightly left, might go slightly right. Anything different than what I'm controlling it to do, that's what I'm looking for. Sometimes you'll see the fly line just quiver for half a second. That's usually a take. So the old adage of hook sets are free definitely applies to Euro nymphing. I probably set the hook 10 times to 1 on maybe there was a fish, maybe not, but I'm setting the hook just in case, and then I'm getting the flies right back in. That's kind of the nice thing about Euro nymphing is you're back right into your strike zone really quickly.
Okay.
That answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
And can you kind of talk about the difference between feeling and seeing?
Yeah.
You say you can see the leader, but then you say you're feeling it.
Yeah, so as you're going through, and that's one of the benefits of using a heavier beaded fly. So if I'm using like a fly like this, you can see this has a very big bead on the top of it. It's going to be thick in the bottom, and you can start to just kind of feel the difference of little rocks, things like that as you're fishing on the bottom. And if you have more aggressive fish, instead of seeing a bobber go down, you're going to feel that through your rod tip. So you're going to feel the fish take it. And it can be a little bit tricky in the beginning to tell the difference between, sometimes you'll go over a rock and a water hydraulic will pull your fly line down. It's more of a soft, steady pull rather than a quick take like what a trout would typically do. And so that's kind of where the feel in the comes into play. A lot of times I like to have a finger on the rod itself instead of the cork, because I can detect some of the more subtle takes if I've got my finger on the rod itself. That answer your question? Okay. What else?
How did you get into Euro nymphing?
Oh,
Have you been Euro nymphing?
a few years ago, I went on a fishing trip on the Gallatin River. Great spot to go Euro nymph. Tons of boulders and structure to fish around. And we had caught maybe 2 or 3 fish, and a guy that was with us was like, you know what, let's try Euro nymphing. We caught probably 50 to 60 fish in like 2 hours after that, and after that I was hooked. Very, very effective. I typically find on a given day I will catch maybe 30 to 40, 50% more fish if I'm Euro nymphing than fishing with other methods. 90% of a fish's diet is under the surface. So when you see big, I mean, it's always fun to see a big hatch, right? And you've got fish rising all around you. Like anybody else, I'm gonna swap this out for a dry fly, and I'm gonna start dry fly fishing. But if you don't see a prolific hatch or you don't see a ton of fish rising to the surface, Euro nymphing or indicator nymphing is a great way to go.
And how about shallow water nymphing? Does Euro nymphing do any better that way? I mean, with an indicator, you usually can't even do it if it's only 18 inches or...
I have caught plenty of fish in 12 inches of water. And the only difference is your sighter's not going to be in the water. A lot of times this fly becomes my sighter, and I'm just fishing one fly through that really shallow run. But if it's looks like it should hold fish, you know, you're 18 inches deep or so, 12, 18 inches deep. And there's a combination of either structure or a seam, or it's the top of a hole. In fact, this fish was my best brown last year on my 3-weight. Yeah, on this rod 3-weight, and that fish was caught in 6 inches of water.
Could you see it?
I could not see it In fact, it was kind of lucky hook set. I was not expecting the take at the top. I was fishing that section of river has all of the magical components to it. There's a big log for structure, a couple of big boulders, and it comes out of a shallow section of water that's really fast, and it dumps into a nice deep bucket with all the structure and some boulders around it. I had cast it up into the shallow just to get my fly's depth so that by the time it got down into that bucket, I was in the feeding zone. As soon as my flies hit the water at the top of that, fish was on. And so I did luckily see the take, and I hooked set, but I was not 100% ready for it, and that fish took me for quite a ride. It was.
Is it hard to land on a 3-weight? 20.
Actually, with these, so I do like this Diamondback. I'll rep some other rods that he's got in here too. I think we've got some Echoes that are good as well. Okay. If you get a decent 3-weight, it's got enough backbone. This lower section of this rod has plenty of power even for a bigger fish. My wife hooked one last year bigger than that fish, and even if I would have had a 6 or 7 weight, there was no saving it. It went right. Fishing a really fast section of the Madison. She hooked about a 24-inch brown, and it was right in the fast current within seconds, and it was popped and it was gone. So what else on what other questions we got?
Stabilize those.
Anything else? All right.
Timing of year.
Ooh, good question. All the time. I always have this rod in my either rigged and ready to go in my truck. If I get out and I'm seeing a bunch of dries popping, fish rising, I might leave that for a little bit. But if they stop, I'm going right back to my truck and I'm grabbing that and I'm fishing right where I saw those fish rising, because I know now they're within 30 or 40 feet of where they were rising. They might have just moved a little bit deeper, a little bit, but winter Euro nymphing can be extremely effective. I don't have any pictures on here from a few weeks ago. I fished the South Fork mid-December, had a fantastic day, probably 20 to 25 fish in 3 hours. Couple of 20-inch rainbows on it. It allows you to fish slow and deep, and that's right where those fish are holding in the winter. So anytime you're not fishing dries. Any other questions?
What flies were working on the South Fork?
Actually, this exact rig that I've got, I never changed. I got sick mid-December, and I actually haven't been out in the last several weeks. So planning to go out. I was actually hoping to get out today. I didn't quite make it out, but so that I've got on here little caddis pattern actually. There were a bunch of scuds on the South Fork that day, and I was trying to approximate a scud, so I threw on a little kind of ratty caddis pattern that was roughly the same size, and then can never beat the pink worm. It does great. This time of year, doing winter fishing, I'm typically sizing up my flies or sizing down. So I don't do a whole lot of in between. I'll typically be throwing a big bugger, woolly bugger, leech patterns, some Pat's rubber legs, bead-headed Pat's rubber legs, some Euro streamers, things like that. or I'm going to the opposite end of the spectrum. Oh, and I should mention eggs, worms, you know, kind of your typical winter fishing stuff. And then midges. Midges will work great. If you want a ton of whitefish, throw on something flashy and green or orange, and you can have 50, 60 fish, whitefish days out on the South Fork. A lot of times I'm catching 20 to 1 on the whitefish to compare to the trout, if I plan my flies right. If I'm catching a ton of whitefish and I don't want to, I just size up my flies so they can't fit it in their mouth. Though I used a salmon fly last year and caught a whitefish on a dry fly salmon fly. That was fun.
That's a trophy.
That is a trophy. Yeah. I couldn't believe it when I brought it in. I thought it was brown. What else? What else we got? Okay.
Materials when you're tying.
I like to just, in general, I like to think heavier and more sparse. So if you're gonna tie, I don't know, any nymph, I'm gonna do a few less wraps with your more absorbent and lighter materials. I'm gonna do a few less wraps, and I might throw some lead wire underneath. I'm gonna throw a tungsten bead on the top. Things of that nature, just kind of generally speaking.
Do you think like the resin ones with, I don't know if that's the actual name of them, but kind of like the tungsten bead with like some flashy thing and then a resin
Kind of like a pertagon? Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yeah.
What about them?
Is that kind of like a good one to throw? I mean, it's in a box, so I'm sure.
I've always got pertagons with me. They don't necessarily look like anything in nature, but they're flashy. They're the right size. They're the right profile, and they catch a lot of fish. Yeah, I've always got a selection of various colors. This is when I was talking whitefish. That fly right there, if you want to catch a ton of whitefish, that one will clean them up.
You run it from a boat, moving boat, or
You can, yeah. I typically, if I'm in a boat, I'm bobber fishing, indicator fishing. However, I've there's no reason not to, especially really solid technique for Euro nymphing from a boat. Anchor the boat, and then you can get out. If you're floating by and you see a great run, I mean, hard thing about a boat is you might get one pass, right? But if you see a fish come up after it, anchor down and work that with your Euro and work all that, the whole hole, bottom to end and left side to right side. And like I said, if you don't have a dedicated Euro rig right now, tie one of these onto your 9-foot 5-weight. Start off with whatever you got and go give it a try. That's how I started. Didn't take me long to go buy my own 10-foot rod. This is my first one. Orvis makes a decent one. Echo makes some good ones. There's
Gray's Fin is a good starter one as well.
Okay, there you go.
They
Good
do
call.
like 10 foot and 11 foot.
Yeah. And don't be afraid of sizing up your Euro rod. I started with a 10-footer and quickly moved to a 10-foot 10, and my next one will probably be an 11-2. I didn't talk about reel selection a whole lot. Any reel that holds your line is a great reel for Euro nymphing because you only ever have about 10 feet out your rod tip. The one thing I will note, if you're using light tippets, having a good
Full gauge.
yeah, smooth drag, because if you're using 6X, having smooth drag for your tippet protection is good. And then when you're ready to splurge, I like weighted reels. So this is a weighted reel. I can adjust the weight in here And so if I'm on switch this to a shorter rod, I can take a little bit of the weight out. It's a good counterbalance because with Euro nymphing, your shoulder's going to get tired. And so having a good counterbalance so that you've got good weight distribution comes in handy, so that you've got a good balance for your rod and your reel, so that it just helps with the arm fatigue at the end of the day. Cool. All right. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Ben? I got about $40 of flies right there.